Foundation of Fiscal and Economic Impact Studies. Beth has more than 25 years of real estate consulting experience. Prior to joining RES, she was a part of the real estate advisory services practice at Coopers & Lybrand. She also served on the professional staff of the Newcastle County Executive's Office, where she was responsible for housing and economic development issues and the administration of county's first-time home buyer mortgage bond program. Beth is a former chair of the Delaware Valley chapter of the Counselors of Real Estate and a past president of the National Council of Housing Market Analysts, a subsidiary of the National Housing and Rehabilitation Association. Before I turn it over to Beth, I'd like to make a couple of notes. Please be sure to mute your phone and listening device during the presentation. If you have any questions, please use the raise hand function during the designated question and answer segment of the presentation, and our chat monitor, Roger Hesketh, will call on you, or enter your question in the chat box and Roger will ask your question during the Q&A segment. Now I'd like to turn it over to Beth. Beth?
Great. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Tamara. That was a lovely introduction. I am going to see how talented I am, though, at actually getting this started. So there we go. Oops, not that talented. Okay, everyone, thank you. Thank you so much for coming to this evening. I hope you'll walk away from this talk thinking like a market analyst. That's our goal. Real estate market analysis is fundamental to everything we do at our firm, RES. About half of our work is market studies, actual documents for projects. So apartments, retail centers, industrial complexes. The other half is related to various types of planning efforts and technical assistance to public agencies. We are very familiar with Wilmington. First of all, this is where I grew up, so I had to put that star on there. But the starred neighborhoods are neighborhoods that we have done market analysis work, either for specific projects or as part of planning efforts, as I mentioned, including the Creative District in West Center City and the East Side Housing Strategy. So I'm really thrilled to be talking to all of you as new Wilmington developers, newly minted. So I'd like to get to know you a little bit. We have a few polling questions that we're going to throw up there if Jenny can do that, so we know who's in our audience. Okay, first of all, what's your connection to Jumpstart Wilmington? Are you a graduate? Are you a future Jumpstarter? You've already been accepted? Or are you a supporter, or do you have kind of just a looser connection and are interested in finding out more? And we will. Okay. Jenny, what's our answer here? Let's see who we have here. Okay, so about half of you are sort of teed up to participate in the Jumpstart program. That's great. And then we have a mix of other folks. Let's have our next question. What's your development experience to date? None, but excited to start. One or two small projects and kind of getting geared up, or would you consider yourself an experienced developer? this is doubly exciting for me as a Delawarean, a former Wilmington resident, and someone who's also quite familiar with the Germantown Jumpstart program. It's just fantastic. This is great. So 3/4 of folks have already dipped their toes in and have started developing, and the rest of the folks are gearing up to start. Okay, we have another question coming. We have 4, just in case you're keeping track. All right, if you have previous development experience, is it in Wilmington? See what our answer is here. I'm going to guess that we have a fairly, wow, quite a mix then. So 2/3 yes in Wilmington and a third not. And these are of the folks who are already developing. So that's great. We have some outside experience as well. And our final question is actually related to market analysis. So what is your experience with real estate market research? A lot? You read studies all the time, bedtime reading perhaps. Some, you try to pay attention to what's going on in your neighborhood, or none. It's a total mystery to me. And this, of course, is most helpful. It'll help me figure out how to best focus our time together tonight. Okay. Wow, we have some folks who read market studies all the time. That's fantastic. And I'm glad the rest of you are interested in market issues. So thank you very much, Jenny, for running our poll. Let's jump in. Let's see if we can get the poll out. So, all right. I'm trying to advance my slide, Jenny. Is it something that's going on? There we go. Gosh, not cooperating. So, market analysis. How does it help developers, large and small, right? At the very broadest scale, it can give you insight into the types of uses, residential, commercial, office, and the types of development, large or small, that are likely to be successful. Zeroing in on specific sites and projects, it can help you evaluate the advantages of different sites and really fine-tune your investment strategy. As you are coming up with a specific project, whether it's a rehab or a new construction project, market analysis helps you think about the types of units, and assuming we're talking residential, I'm going to make that assumption tonight. What kind of bedroom distribution, 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, what's the square footage, what kind of features and amenities do you need, and most importantly, what's the pricing? What can you charge either in rent or as a sales price? For larger projects, third-party documentation, part of the third-party documentation is often a market study required by lenders, investors, and other funders. So, not quite at that point of needing to have actual reports to submit to folks who would like to give you money. In the meantime, if you learn to think like a market analyst, you'll be able to make better investment decisions. So that's what we're talking about tonight. And what we're seeing right now on the screen are all these stock image people using the tools of market analysis, which are basically shoe leather, your own eyes, your computer and your phone. So effective real estate market research requires sort of 3 buckets of expertise, right? One is field work. You know, everything about real estate is location, is influenced by location, and it's a 3-dimensional product. So you really have to be out there seeing your site in relation to surroundings as well as the competition. But you also need to do research, primary research. And what I mean by that is you need to make calls and ask questions, understand your competition, talk to other folks who are more familiar with the neighborhood or the market, test your assumptions. So that's the phone part of it. And data, there's a lot of data available. And you need to look at that too. But again, you cannot do market research effectively just sort of removed on the computer looking at data. So all 3 of these factors interact and form a check, you know. So if a couple of these buckets of information align, you can feel more confident that you're on the right track research-wise than if you just, you know, are basing your thoughts on interviewing one person, for instance. But in addition to these 3 buckets of information, it's really critical that you bring an open mind to the process. I think we've all fallen in love, right, with real estate, or at least with our own hunches, and it's very important to step back and kind of question it by doing taking a more analytical and disciplined approach. So what is the real estate market analysis process? I'm going to give you six tasks or steps that all together will help you think like a market analyst. First has to do with assessing location and site characteristics. The second is about understanding the bigger economic and demographic context within which you're working. The third is to have a good, strong sense of the market area in which you're competing. Where are you drawing your buyers or your prospective tenants from, geographically speaking? The fourth is researching competitive supply. The fifth is really thinking about your target market for your building and evaluating project-specific demand. And then, of course, 6 is putting it all together. So each of these items, 1 through 5 on their own, gives you some insight, but it's really the interplay between them that helps you make better decisions about real estate. So let's talk about location and site characteristics. If I only convey one thing to you tonight, it's to think like your tenant and buyer, right? You need to consider the context. Is this a lovely residential area, or am I right next to an industrial use? How visible is my property? And this really makes, this is important for marketing your property. Can people find it? Can they see it? Do they know it's available? And sort of along that same line, in a city of one-way streets and public transit, how accessible is the building that you are trying to market? Is it in the middle of a warren of one-way streets that makes it difficult for people to find until they throw up their hands and say, I just can't find it? Is it near public transit? Can people easily jump on the bus and get to work if that's their mode of transportation? So first and foremost, think about those issues. What's the impact of surrounding land uses? Again, think like your tenant or your buyer, right? Do you have an intact, let me get a pointer here. Do you have an intact block of well-maintained homes, or do you have some boarded up vacant properties? Now, if you are somebody who's considering trying to build some critical mass and you can control those properties, that's one thing. If you don't have control of those properties, it becomes a negative for you and the positioning of your own property. Is there commercial? Are there commercial uses on the block or nearby? And are they positive? Is this great? Someone can walk and get that that proverbial gallon of milk, or is there a lot of late night activity? Is it a negative use? So you need to understand that. And if you're in a part of the city where there's more landscaping, small yards, how are they maintained? What kind of message is that sending your prospective tenant or buyer? So let's look. This is actually a shot from Washington Street, I think around 8th and Washington, or it's looking up 8th maybe. So how would we approach this, looking at surrounding uses? What would we be thinking about? We see here, looks like an auto-related use and a church, right? So maybe not apparently problematic uses, but you as a potential investor on this block would probably want to make sure that the auto-related use is operating within certain hours and not creating a lot of noise. You would want to understand how secure this big lot is. Are people hanging out there? Also, another thought when you have a big open lot, particularly for parking in Wilmington, is it a potential development site? Is that a holding use? And might something be going up across the street from your prospective site? So that could be a good thing or that could be a bad thing, but you want to be thinking all the time about that prospect. And then we have a church, which is a wonderful community use, but you also want to understand how active it is. Do they have 1,000 people coming in for services on Sunday? Is parking crazy as a result? Do they run programs every night? You just want to have a sense of activity on different days of the week and different times of day. Okay, how convenient is your site or your prospective project to services, amenities, and we spoke about transit already. Again, thinking like your tenant or buyer. If your prospective tenant, say, is a family, you have a three-bedroom row house that you are rehabbing. Where's the daycare? What are the schools like? Are they easy to get to the schools? Those kind of questions, where would people go to grocery shop? Are they likely to have a car? Where are they going to park? And so on. So you need to think beyond your site and the immediate surroundings and think about proximity to amenities and services. And then safety issues. And that's really there are a lot of different factors that contribute to someone's sense of safety, right? Street lighting is one, but also street activity, positive or negative. If there's a lot of eyes on the street, people are out, kids are playing, people walking to and from work, that makes the street feel safe, right? If there are a lot of people hanging out at all hours, maybe the street feels less safe. So again, think like your tenant or buyer. Traffic speeds. As someone who has sat in a parked car trying to get pictures of properties and not been able to get out of my door because of traffic coming by at a crazy speed, I know that impacts your enjoyment of a particular block. But most importantly is crime, what's going on. Luckily in Wilmington, you have a couple of good sources of information. One is the police department's CompStat report, which is at the precinct level. So you can figure out which police precinct your properties are in and kind of monitor the crime situation that way. And then also from the Wilmington Police website, they link you to crime mapping. You're probably familiar with this, but you can see relatively recent incidents and sort of how they play out spatially around the neighborhood in which you're considering working. You also want to obviously keep an eye on the news if there's something that is particularly, that has made the news and is a particularly concerning incident that obviously can affect people's perception of your area. Now, we're still on location and site characteristics, but this is my last slide on that. And now I'm telling you to think like a developer, not like your tenant or buyer, okay? Your watchword should be, if you are working in a neighborhood that is transitional, your watchword needs to be, think about the edge, anchor yourself to something strong, and you can be the next property or the next block, but don't be an island. You know, if it's an area that's really troubled and where the market's weak, you don't want to be sitting in the middle with 3 or 4 blocks of weakness in every direction around you. So try to anchor yourself to something strong. This happens to be from the Philadelphia Land Bank strategic plan, and it was, you know, helping people figure out where those areas, those edges are, and where there was land bank property. So the green areas are strong markets, and the kind of bright gold are emerging markets, and the edges of those emerging markets are where probably some good value appreciation opportunities exist. So that was site and location evaluation. Let's talk about understanding the broader economic and demographic trends in the area. And we're talking about Wilmington, so Wilmington, Newcastle County. I think since you all are interested in real estate, you're probably all tuned into this anyway, but just to give us a little bit of discipline about it, you want to understand the economic profile of the area, first of all. Sort of how do the jobs break down? They're in banking, they're in healthcare, you know, what are the other sectors where there's a lot of employment of Wilmington residents? And then what's happening in those sectors? Couple things here. We've got, you know, what happened over the last decade with the Wilmington Hospital and the expansion, which created several hundred jobs. Barclays has announced new jobs. They're on different ends of the central business district. So what does that mean for neighborhoods where people might want to live if they were interested in those jobs? So that was employment trend. Household growth. Households are the basic building block of residential demand. Population's interesting, but households, one household, one housing unit, that's what you have to look at. So articles about the census, new census estimates, what's happening with household growth, and what's going on with new public investment, right? New streetscape, new parks, whatever it might be, but understanding where public money is going in, which may be kind of interesting right now with some of the things that are coming out of Washington. It's unclear what some of the programs are, but you may see some money for specific infrastructure that could make certain neighborhoods more attractive than they are now. And then overall real estate market conditions. I'm sure you're kind of going, well, yeah, that's why we're sitting here. But I'm sure you see articles on the web and in the newspaper about that are reports, right, from commercial brokerages or the city, you know, just talking about trends, about rental vacancy, about apartment development and such. You should be monitoring that because that just gives you the baseline to think about the market for neighborhoods you're interested in. So what are some of the sources? Local news sources, the city itself, city departments, neighborhood plans, always good to check first as you start in a neighborhood you may not be as familiar with. but check the dates, right? Because they tend to last on the internet forever. So you want to make sure you're looking at the most recent plan and concepts. Usually there's a lot of good information in there. Department of Labor, good information on the breakdown of employment in the market. Board of Realtors and commercial brokerage, free usually, data on the general condition of both the residential and commercial markets. So now you have an idea of how to look at your sites from the perspective of your tenants and buyers. You are thinking about the bigger market picture, the bigger economic situation. So now let's drill down to a specific project you're considering. So you need to really start thinking about the geography within which your property is going to compete for tenants or home buyers. So what are some of the things that affect that? Physical boundaries and psychological boundaries or barriers. So physical barriers, the river, for instance, probably not pulling too many people from Salem County, New Jersey, but maybe your research indicates that. But my guess is that the river is a pretty big barrier. Psychological barriers between neighborhoods, very important. We talked about the buckets of information you're collecting. That's something to really chat with folks about. You know, will I get people from all over Wilmington in my building? In this case, we were working on a property in Quaker Hill, and we spoke with a lot of the managers of other apartment buildings, and they said we pull a lot of people from Newcastle in the area toward Newcastle outside the city. So you can see that our market area takes into account that area immediately south of Wilmington. A residential market area is almost never, 99% of the time, not a circle. If it's a circle, something's wrong. A retail trade area, if you were looking at the potential to lease perhaps a small retail property, a retail trade area, it's more standardly a radius away from the property. That's a standard way of looking at how much spending power there is in an area. But a residential market area is generally more related to the kind of things I have on the slide. School district boundaries, where employment is, how transportation connections lay out. So once you have your competitive market area defined, that's a geography that you're going to use to think about researching competitive supply and also project-specific demand. So let's talk about supply first. What are the competitive properties in the PMA? So if your property is a small apartment building, what are the other small apartment buildings? Or if you feel that your competitors are also individual row houses that are being rented for sale, or duplexes, twins, you would be looking at those as well. And you want to know a bunch of things about the competitors, right? And you're thinking all the time when you're thinking about the comps, how is that going to influence and or stack up against what I'm envisioning my project? So is the location superior or inferior? What kind of unit types are in the competitive properties? What kind of features and amenities do they have? You know, do they have central air? Do they have a small yard? Do they have more than one bathroom? Things like that are important to note. What is the asking rent, or what is the sales? What are the sales price? What is the sales price that they are asking? And for rental properties, very important. How are the utilities handled? Are they included in the rent, or does the tenant have to pony up for all utilities? Understanding that mix is really important. Thinking again, like your tenant, that has to do with what they can afford to pay in rent. So you cannot compare rental properties without comparing what utilities are included in the rent, and then the performance of the property. If it's a multifamily rental, how leased up is it? If it's a single family rental, how long has it been sitting there, right? Same thing with sales price or sales pace. If it's a project that's offered or a building that's offered for sale, how many days on market has it been there? So those are all things to note so that you can think about how your proposed development would stack up and what that means for pricing or the kinds of features that you might want to include in your development plan. Now, after you look at the competitive landscape, you might say, wow, there's a product type that is missing. Maybe I should be developing that. And that is a very reasonable question and sometimes a really good opportunity to consider, but you have to use caution. It could be that the reason there is not that product in the market is because people don't want it. And a big example of that in a lot of markets we work in is efficiencies. So that becomes an issue, right? Would efficiencies be more marketable because they would be more affordable to people? So if it's an area with rapidly rising prices, that is a possibility. But in a lot of cases, that product type is not prevalent because it's been tried and not been successful. So we see a lot of places where efficiencies are being combined and turned into one-bedroom apartments. And the other question you want to ask yourself after you've surveyed what's there is what might be coming down the road, what's in we call it the development pipeline. So are there things that have been approved that are ready to come out of the ground? Are there things people are, mulling over that could either maybe it would be a positive for you because it would create a critical mass of new development in a location. But it's also important to understand whether the market might become saturated. So when we keep track of competitive supply, we do it a couple different ways. One way we do it is just by a sheet, having a sheet for each property we're looking at. That gives you a lot of room to take notes, slap a picture on to remind yourself as you're considering the properties later on. And as you can see, a lot of places to put information, age of the property, how the utilities are handled, what are some special features of the property, and what's the unit breakdown and the asking rent or the current rent. So that is one approach we take. Another approach, and maybe you've done this already, you've developed your individual project information system, but you might want to compare them all on one page because it's much easier when they're all on one page. And whether you're doing this on a computer, in a notebook, whatever, if you put it all on one page, it's much easier to see patterns. Maybe you see that all the buildings that have efficiencies have a lot of vacancy or not. And you can see in the market what the tenants typically expect to pay, and you can see what kinds of amenities are common in the competition. So all of that really helps as you're formulating your development program. So let's talk about the good, the better, and the best places to get information about the competitive supply, right? There's a lot of information online. So absolutely, Zillow, Trulia, Craigslist, apartments.com, check them all out. Realtor for properties for sale, any of the realtor sites as well. I like PadMapper. If you, I don't know if you're familiar with that or not, but it's a site that's based on a map, and it kind of scrapes listings from a lot of other sites, so you can very quickly see what's being listed on 4 or 5 different sites, and see how it relates to your specific property or the neighborhood you're interested in. I probably don't need to tell you, you have to be a little bit skeptical sometimes if something looks like, particularly on Craigslist. We always try to confirm things because sometimes people are putting a teaser rent out there and that's not real. They just want to get that phone call. So that gets me to better is actually talking to folks, talking to property managers, talking to brokers active in the area to get a sense of what's going on with the competitive supply. And the gold standard is shopping the competition. So if you can get out there and go to open houses, check out other for rent properties, that will really give you the best idea of how to make your project competitive. All right, so now we've talked about supply. Let's talk about demand. I'm going to talk in general. I'm going to give you kind of the big picture of how we approach this, typically for bigger projects, multifamily apartment buildings, or larger for sale developments. But there are a lot of there's a lot of nuggets here that apply and that you can take to a smaller development. So as I mentioned, households are the driver of residential demand. So part of your job is to really think about, like, who is this household that I want to serve, that I think I am serving in my building. And there are a lot of factors that influence what types of housing households demand. The age. When we talk about household age, we're talking about age of the head of household. So, you know, you can think about it as life stage, right? They're young households, you know, individuals maybe who are just leaving their, you know, parents' house, all the way to older folks, empty nesters, and people in between, right? So age, obviously income, influences how much they can pay for property. Their tenure. Tenure is a fancy term, right, for renter, whether they're renters or homeowners. So if you have a rental property, it's more likely that your demand is going to come from renters. Not always, but particularly, you know, in 2008 when we went through the foreclosure situation, you had former home owners who became part of the renter pool. But it's good to understand that breakdown. And household size, right? All of those factors are going to influence the type of product somebody wants and what they're willing to pay. You also, if you are interested, I know that you guys have just touched on this in the Jumpstart program, but if you are interested in, say, accepting Section 8, in a rental property, you need to understand what those income limits are, so you know who is qualified to potentially live at your property. You can get that from the Delaware State Housing Authority at that website. So you have your tenant profile. How many of them are there in the market area? So I've provided some sources, the U.S. Census Bureau, some proprietary data vendors. There are a couple. One is called Esri, another is called Claritas. The advantage of those, the plus is that they do projections, which is super helpful, right? Because thinking about a trend forward would be very useful, but they do have a pretty hefty price tag. You may be able to get the reports by going to their website and just ordering them individually. A lot of library systems provide some access to these services. I did a little bit of looking for Newcastle County system in the Wilmington Library. I couldn't find this, but it would be worth a call to the reference librarian. They're super helpful a lot of times. Finally, there's a product that's really targeted specifically to renter and homeowner market research. It's called Ribbon Demographics, and in a minute I'll show you an example. They have what they call HISTA tabulations, which are households by income, size, tenure, and age, which are all the factors we just talked about. Those tabulations, crisscrossing all of those things, is not available from the census, but this is a product that Ribbon has come up with and is actually somewhat reasonable for Wilmington. You can get all the census tracts and all the zips for something like $495, maybe something that Jumpstart Wilmington might think about making available to your graduates. It's just something to think about. So we'll look at that in a minute, but what's the trend? So you've got your buyer profile, you understand about how many folks there are in that target pool of tenants or buyers. So what's a trend? Has it been increasing, right? That would be great. But maybe it's been going down. What we are seeing with the baby boom generation is that folks are aging, and that number is dropping in the working age demographic age cohorts. So just because that's happening, or if there's no growth in your market area, one thing to really think about is, do I have an opportunity to address replacement demand? Replacement demand is, you have obsolete stock. So if you're in a market that has low vacancy and older housing stock, you may have people who are willing to pay a little bit more if there was just a nicer product out there. So household growth is sort of a slam dunk indicator of residential demand, but replacement demand is something to consider in older cities as well. I'm going to show you real quick. I'm going to get to questions in just a minute, but here's the HISTA data. You can see this is a renter household in a certain age group. Here's their incomes and their household sizes. So there's a similar thing for owners. It's sliced and diced that way, and also projections, 5-year projections. So pretty helpful to kind of get a closer idea of how many folks may be in your target pool. So putting it all together, right? You've now done these other 5 things, and it's all swirling around, but you can use that information to answer some questions. First of all, is my location competitive, right? Is what I was thinking about my development, is that responsive to the market, or do I need to rethink the product? How should my property be priced relative to the competition? So we talked about that superior and inferior aspect. That's something to keep in mind for pricing. And once you kind of come up with that tentative pricing, that influences what income households would need to have to afford that rent or that sales price. So then you can start thinking, like, are there enough people here with the income and household characteristics we call it capture rate, right? If you found there were 70 people and you're doing whatever, I'll say 140, 70 households, you're doing a 140 unit building, that's a red flag, right? So there aren't enough households. Less of an issue, that's more of an issue for bigger projects, but less of an issue for a small project. It's still something you should be thinking about. And finally, how can I reach my target renters or buyers? There's all the ways we talked about posting, your listing, but are there other ways? If your target is older folks who live in a neighborhood, is going through the churches, a lot of times we see as a successful way to market properties. If you're in a neighborhood of a particular ethnicity, finding leaders in that neighborhood and real estate offices that speak the language of those folks is also a good strategy. So I'm watching my clock. I'm through my slides. I'm really interested to know what kind of questions you guys might have to help you start thinking like a market analyst.
Beth, we had one question from very early that somebody posted in the chat, and that was from Yamanak, and it was, what are some typical preliminary reports? And if she would like to speak and, you know, expand on that question, that's fine too.
Sure. So typical, you mean a report that we might prepare as a preliminary screen for a client?
Right, yeah. So first, thank you, Beth, for taking the time to speak with us. I do appreciate it. It's very helpful, the information that you're providing. You've given us a lot of things to consider. I'm just wondering, like, specifically, what are some like good reports that we should maybe try to build a foundation on as we're doing these surveys and making these calls, like kind of in our portfolio or our handbook per se, like the specific names of some reports that we should try to develop or create as we're out there making these judgments.
So I just want to make sure I understand your question. So are you talking about the way that I showed a couple examples of the competitive supply?
Right, yeah. One looked like a competitive supply, maybe market analysis or something, maybe it's called. I'm not sure, but just like if there's some standard names of reports of the information that we developed, so we could just like take that away, Google that, look that up, expound on that possibly.
Let me think on that a little. I mean, there certainly are say reports from census, and you know, I had shown you a small list of potential sources of information on like broader economic conditions. So there are sort of specific reports and such, like from the Department of Labor and from the Census Bureau, that we look at. So that might be something that I can follow up with the leadership at Jumpstart.
Cool, thank you.
Beth, Wally has a question. It looks like he has his hand up.
Okay. Oh wait, I've got to get into a different view here.
Wally, go ahead.
Yes, I just want to echo the earlier thanks by Ms. Israel, just thanking you so much, Ms. Beckett. I really learned a lot from your presentation, very informative and information we can apply right away. So my question deals with how to rely on data that you see happening in the market. For instance, in the Wilmington area, particularly on the east side, there are some interesting things going on with some sales that are clearly outpacing what you see in terms of the top of the market for the past 3 or 4 years. There's been some recent sales that are properties are selling after they've been renovated, of course, for $40,000 to $50,000 over what the prior high end of the market had been. And it's not a critical mass yet, but it's happening, here and there. And my question in terms of that context is, how does a market analyst sort of look to that data? And, is one enough to sort of say, yes, investor, come, this is likely a trend that you can latch onto, or is it for market analysts a little bit more skeptical? How do you sort of read into those outliers as they're happening? I was just curious about that.
So that's a really good question, and that kind of harkens back to the buckets of information I was talking about. So I would put that in data, right? That's in the data bucket. I see this sale. Wow, it seems so out of context. That's when I would start to try to talk to some real estate brokers who are active in the area. Like, gosh, did you see this sale? What do you think's going on there? Or sales, is this part of a trend, or is there something, something odd happening, because sometimes there are odd things. And a lot of times if you talk to 2 or 3 people and you already have this data point, they have probably seen the data point too. And you often can get the anecdotes sometimes for, you're talking about is if something's just weird and not an indicator of actual market demand. Sometimes you can get a perspective from interviews. The other thing, sometimes when you see big prices, and maybe you are familiar with this, but sometimes they're blanket sales that have multiple properties in them, and that all in some of the databases, all of the properties get that number. Do you know what I mean? So if there's 3 properties, they all look like they sold for $225,000, and you're like, huh. So sometimes just getting familiar with little quirks of the data is helpful.
Thank you for that response. I appreciate it.
I don't see any more hands or questions in the chat box at the moment. Does anybody have another question?
I actually do have another question.
Okay.
So it goes to the point about understanding the type of amenities that are presently in the market. And you mentioned, you used, I think, the efficiency example to say, well, okay, you might see an opportunity where there's no efficiencies in this market, but it might be for a reason. And my question lends to, the idea of a market having a certain character in terms of the finishes that you see, or the type of, in terms of just what you see in that area. What's your sense of, how you analyze whether or not it's appropriate to then set yourself apart by, putting a little bit more, or frankly, a lot more than what that market may particularly reflect? Is that, how do you analyze that in terms of saying whether or not that's a sound approach, or you're just being foolish with your resources?
Well, I think a lot of it depends on what you need to charge, right? To make that kind of, higher end product work. So if you want to increase the quality or the positioning of the product, and the rent is going to reflect that, I kind of start with the rent, right? Gosh, is that achievable in this market area? Am I attached to something strong? Is that what have the rents been doing? Are they trending in a direction? I mean, you can be top of the market, but you want there to be a continuum, right? You don't want necessarily everybody else to be here, right? So that I would really look at it as, I want to charge X rent for all these bells and whistles. Is that reasonable at this location in Wilmington? Is my target market there, people with the incomes to afford it?
Very helpful, thank you.
And it looks like Tali has a hand up. Tali?
I guess I should unmute myself to speak.
Hi.
I'll extend the same sentiments as everyone before me, and thank you, Beth, for the knowledge that you shared with each of us, and thank the Jumpstart team for even putting this together, for even putting us in this position. For me, I guess my question kind of stems a little bit from Wally's a little bit. So a little bit of what I've done, like in the last year or so, I've just kind of been around Wilmington, walking around Wilmington, analyzing the different areas, and specifically speaking to East Sides. I see a lot of properties like in the East Side area with the Wilmington Neighborhood Conservative Land Bank sticker and stamps in it. In addition to just wanting to redevelop properties and, get into real estate, a big part of what I'm actually aiming to do is more so from the social economic piece. So I run a company called We Mean Business, and our mission is to solve problems in underserved communities. As such, just being in Wilmington, one of the things I identified was, well, homelessness is a real thing. It's a big thing. And I see a lot of properties just kind of sitting with these stamps on there. And I'm fairly ignorant to even just the understanding of it, or just the processing of information in regards to that. And I speak, you know, as you say, get the demographic research, speak to a lot of different people. And for me, that's just kind of how I process. I'm very big on, well, speak to the realtors, speak to the people in the community. And the information from there becomes a little bit different. So I'll give you a classic example. I was in East Side, I think it was Carter Street. And we're just walking around looking at different properties. A friend of mine said, hey, you know, they just, they're selling the house next door to my mom for like $6,000. And I was like, what? That doesn't make sense. It doesn't sound real. And then we went around there and she's like, yeah, it used to be a bando. Somebody just bought the one next door and redeveloped that. So I guess my question is, the properties with the stickers and just properties that's bandos, which would more so be my focus. What do you advise on markets in that, just in those general areas, and with the understanding that, well, property values are generally down in those areas, just with the nature of those communities, the likelihood of those properties going back up, and a lot of those properties has been sitting for years. And you know, a guy said to me, hey, you know, when you're looking at these properties, look at the bricks on the outside, how they stick out, and just, you know, simple information like that. And you speak about, you know, potentially taking properties and knocking them down and putting up new ones if they've been sitting for a while. But if you do that in these communities, that the return isn't necessarily realistic. So what is your advice, I guess, in that sense? I know is a broad question. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I just want to back up for 1 second. At the beginning of your question, you talked about homeless households. Is your question about housing homeless folks, or is it more about just the nature?
I guess it was more so on the need. So my focus more so on the need base, and it's not even just housing the homeless, which, I mean, that will tie into more so what I'm doing later on. Mm-hmm. But it's just identifying there's a bunch of land bank properties that I'm not necessarily understanding what the primary focus is. And we have this really big issue. And a lot of these homeless, they're coming from these same communities where these land banks homes are stationed. And for me, it's just, well, if we have a lot of redevelopers, why are people particularly staying away from these properties, and just not even looking to go there? And is it just because, well, the money isn't there, or these properties are really just terrible investment from a property standpoint?
So, and just, you know, full disclosure that I'm not that familiar with how the land bank is structured in Wilmington. I am very familiar with how it is in Philadelphia, having worked on the strategic plan. You know, you've talked about a lot of complexity, right? So let me take a couple things. Cost, right? That's a challenge. So cost of, it may be a $6,000 shell. And people say, well, you know, there are people homeless and there's $6,000 shell, but to make it habitable, right? As you're probably aware from just Jumpstart, right? Is you have to really pencil that out and see what some of the structural issues are, and, you know, and then you're now it's not a $6,000 property.
Right.
So, you know, this has been a big challenge right now up in Philly. If you've been reading the papers, the Philadelphia Housing Authority has hundreds of vacant, almost abandoned properties that they own. And we have a huge homeless problem as well. And the folks were just like, my gosh, you're a housing authority and you have all this vacant property. You need to help us house these people. So sometimes I think that's beyond the scope of a single developer, and you need folks to have some access to different sources of funding as well. Again, all I can say is be on the edge. Don't be an island. Be on the edge.
It sounds like you're telling me I need made better friends, Beth. Is what it sounds like.
No.
No, I appreciate the feedback. Thank you.
And Tally, this is Deanna Sargent with Cinnaire. We
run the Jumpstart Wilmington program, and I'd be happy to talk more with you about your question. But Beth's succinct response is spot on. As she said, you know, you may see a property that costs $6,000, but the rehab cost may be very extensive because of the nature of the property. And as she also stated as well, sometimes some developers are not developing those projects or those properties because of the sources of funding that's needed for your capital stack, especially if the cost to develop exceeds the cost that you get in return, especially for the population that you talked about serving, people experiencing homelessness. That would warrant the developer needing some additional subsidy that's going to help with not only the development, but also the continued operation of the property. So that's probably why you're not seeing a lot of that happening in particular neighborhoods. But again, if you want to talk about some of the nuances, and I recognize your name, so I think you're going through the program in the future. So I'm super excited about that. We all are. But I'm happy to chat with you more about those dynamics in Wilmington.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you both. I love this like tag team combination response. It's amazing. Thank you both.
Roger, have we come to the end of the Q&A?
It does not look like we have any more questions, and I do not believe we have much more time for questions. So.
Well, before I turn it back over to Tamira, I just want to say thank you so much for the opportunity to chat with you. I'm just totally psyched to see people who care so much about Wilmington and are interested in getting into the development world. So best of luck to all of you.
Thank you so much, Beth. That was great. And thank you for your expertise and your knowledge on this. I'm pretty sure a lot of the information that was given tonight was very valuable to our participants. So now I just hope that you all will be able to complete a brief survey for us. We will provide a survey in the chat for you, and we would love to receive your feedback on this event as well as topics you would like to see in the future. The survey should only take 3 minutes. Our next Kickstart session will be held in June, so be on the lookout for any invitations for that. And I just want to say thank you all and have a great evening.